Oprah Winfrey Deep Dive, we very briefly talked about the McKenzie and the John Phillips situation, and it really reminded me just how atrociously McKenzie Phillips was treated by the media after she came out with the allegations against her father. I really think she was treated so poorly simply because of who her father was and how much of a legend he was in the music industry. So for anyone who is not aware, let me give you a really quick background, and keep in mind this is a fairly surface level summary. The lore with John Phillips, the Phillips family, the mamas and the papas goes extremely deep. I think to fully understand just how vile and awful and disgusting of a human being that John Phillips was, you kind of have to get a little bit of the backstory. I made a handy dandy little family tree here. Hopefully it makes it a little bit easier for everyone to understand. Hopefully it's not cut off on one side. If it is, I'll just zoom in so that everyone can see all the people. So John Phillips got his start in the music industry with a band called Journeyman, which was decently successful. And around 1957, he got married to a woman named Susan Adams. So Susan was John's first wife, and they had Mackenzie and Jeffrey together. Jeffrey really stayed out of the spotlight pretty much his whole life, and Mackenzie was a child star. She did acting, modeling, and we'll get more into Mackenzie here shortly. Not long after the arrival of Mackenzie and Jeffrey, John Phillips would leave behind his band, the Journeymen, and start a new band with 3 other members, Cass Elliot, Denny Doherty, and Michelle Gilliam. That band would be called the Mamas and the Papas. A lot of lore behind the beginnings of the Mamas and the Papas as a band. For example, John Phillips was hesitant to allow Cass Elliot to be a part of their band because he was afraid that since Cass Elliot was overweight, her image would turn audience members off by seeing a larger woman up on stage. But eventually the 4 came to an agreement. They started their band and they began performing locally in pursuit of a record deal, which they did receive in 1965. When John was about 27 years old, he had an affair on his wife Susan with fellow bandmate Michelle Gilliam. And at the time of this affair beginning, like I said, John was 27 and quickly approaching his 30s, and at the time, Michelle was still in high school. This affair ultimately caused John to divorce Susan, and a few years later, he would go on to marry Michelle when she turned 18 years old. The Mamas and the Papas would move to California, and they were finding a lot of success in the music industry. They were really paving out a genre of folk music, being more mainstream. Mamas and the Papas were living the Hollywood dream for quite some time after they moved to California. They were often partying at lavish Hollywood parties and rubbing shoulders with some of the biggest stars of their time. John, Michelle, Denny, and Cass all also struck up a close friendship with the disgraced movie director Roman Polanski, who was married to Sharon Tate. The friendship between Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate, John Phillips, and Michelle Phillips would begin to sour after Michelle Phillips and Roman Polanski had an affair with one another while Sharon Tate was pregnant with Roman Polanski's child. In fact, the night of the Manson family unalivings, where Sharon Tate and her unborn baby's life were prematurely taken, along with 4 other victims, John and Michelle were both invited over to the home that Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski were renting, which would hours later become a crime scene. Because John and Michelle were too heavily under the influence, they were unable to attend. And while this was a very believable excuse for John Phillips and Michelle Phillips to not attend, as they were both habitual recreational substance users, Roman Polanski believed that John Phillips had something to do with the unalivings of Sharon Tate and the other victims' night of the Manson family unalivings. It was reported that Roman Polanski even threatened John Phillips with a weapon from the kitchen because he was so certain that John Phillips had something to do with the unaliving of his wife and his unborn son. Of course, we later found out that the Manson family was behind this vicious and horrific attack. But John Phillips and Cass Elliot were both called to testify in the trials for the Manson family. Okay, so briefly referring back to the family tree here for a moment. So when Michelle is in about her 20s, she and John Phillips give birth to a little girl, and they name her China Phillips. And China Phillips would go on to be one of the 3 members of the 90s pop trio, Wilson Phillips. China Phillips would also go on to marry Billy Baldwin, one of the 4 Baldwin brothers. And as we know, Billy Baldwin is Hailey Bieber's uncle, as Billy Baldwin and Stephen Baldwin are brothers, and Hailey Bieber is Justin Bieber's wife. Okay, so we're winding back. After China was born, Michelle would go on to have another affair. But this time Michelle had an affair with one of the bandmates, one of the members of the Mamas and the Papas, Denny Doherty. This would cause a massive issue within the dynamic of the Mamas and the Papas. John was pissed because he had given Michelle a lot of freedom within their marriage to be with other people, but he absolutely did not approve of this hookup at all. It was also incredibly messy because Cass Elliot had expressed having romantic feelings for Denny Doherty, but he unfortunately did not feel the same way about her, and even more tension arose amongst the bandmates after John had an affair with Mia Farrow, who was an actress and model at the time, married to Frank Sinatra. And as we know, much further down the line, Mia Farrow would go on to be married to Woody Allen, which is just a whole other topic within itself. But when Frank Sinatra, Mia Farrow's husband at the time, found out that John Phillips and his wife had an affair, this pissed him off, and he allegedly called in a favor to his connections through the mob and sent a very clear warning to John Phillips to stay away from his wife. So eventually all would be forgiven amongst the bandmates, and all 4 of them would go back to making music for about another year before Michelle would have an affair with another musician named Gene Clark, and this affair would not be forgiven by John Phillips. John not forgiving Michelle would also lead to Michelle and John divorcing, and the Mamas and the Papas all unanimously deciding that Michelle was fired from the band. Not long after John and Michelle divorced, John would go on to get married for a 3rd time, this time to a South African actress, model, and singer, Genevieve Waite. John and Genevieve would get married, and they would go on to have 2 children together, Tamerlane Phillips and Bijou Phillips. At this point in John Phillips' life, his health began to kind of take a drastic turn. His health began to suffer. He had to go through a liver transplant, and all of these health issues were mostly caused due to overconsumption of spirits and prolonged use of recreational substances. And as many of us know, John Phillips' daughter, Bijou Phillips, would later go on to marry Danny Masterson, the disgraced actor who is now in prison for R-wording 2 different women. And I believe Bijou is in the process of divorcing Danny Masterson. John Phillips would eventually divorce his 3rd wife, Genevieve, and he would remarry for a 4th time, but ultimately he would succumb to heart failure at the age of 65. After John passed away, his firstborn daughter, his second-born child, McKenzie Phillips, came forward and shared she had been horrifically victimized by her father for years in the worst way imaginable. McKenzie wrote a book, a memoir, detailing what it was really like growing up in the spotlight, while also hiding a very dark and horrific secret from the public.
Let's get to the secret that you have been keeping from the public all of these years. It's on page 108. Would you read it?
Wow. Okay. Isn't exactly how I envisioned this going down, but
okay,
that's all right. I feel
get to it.
Vulnerable and frightened, but here we go. I woke up that night from a blackout to find myself having sex with my own father.
And this repeated and ongoing SA would eventually turn into what McKenzie described as a consensual physical relationship between herself and her father. Obviously, as we know, no one can legally consent to that kind of relationship with their father. This sick relationship would ultimately come to an end after McKenzie became pregnant after about a decade of this going on, and she ultimately would terminate her pregnancy that she conceived with her father. A really big part of McKenzie and John's dynamic had to do with substances. In McKenzie's childhood, she spent a great deal of time traveling to the Virgin Islands along with her father's bandmates from the Mamas and the Papas, and these trips to the Virgin Islands always included Denny, John, Michelle, and Cass consuming copious amounts of substances, including liquid LSD and other substances that you consume through needles. So McKenzie was witnessing substance use starting around the age of 5 years old, and John taught McKenzie how to roll up, so to speak, at the age of 10 years old. And at the age of 11 years old, McKenzie used Coca-Cola, let's say, for the first time. For the majority of John's life and for all of McKenzie's life, John was a daily substance user, sometimes using every 15 minutes. While McKenzie was exposed to a lot of awful things throughout her childhood, she's been adamant that nothing physically inappropriate happened between herself and her father until she turned the age of 19 years old. And the first time John S.'d his daughter was after they had blacked out from over-consuming substances. McKenzie does tell her story best herself, so I do encourage you to read her memoir if you have the mental capacity to read it. I know it's a very difficult read. She does go into a lot of detail about the dynamic between herself and her father for those 10 years. Eventually, some of John Phillips' children have come forward and shared that they have forgiveness for their father despite the wake of destruction he left throughout his life and in his passing. Some of those individuals are McKenzie herself has expressed she forgives her father, and China Phillips as well has expressed forgiveness for her father, but nonetheless are still traumatized and horrified at what their father was capable of doing. Despite coming forward with this highly traumatic and highly controversial truth that McKenzie lived, she was still shown favor in the entertainment industry. I'm sure was a relief after so many have been blacklisted for coming forward with accusations against powerful people in the industry. McKenzie's father was absolutely one of those powerful men in the industry. McKenzie has found a lot of success in the film and TV industry. She's been on shows such as ER, Criminal Minds, Cold Case, Without a Trace, and of course many of us know her as Barb from Orange is the New Black. Even though it is well-known knowledge that not only did John Phillips begin dating Michelle Phillips while she was still in high school and he was approaching his 30s, it has also come out that he SA'd his own daughter for over a decade and fed her illegal substances. Despite those two things alone, it is not uncommon to still hear songs by the Mamas and the Papas on the radio to this day. The John Phillips, Baldwin's, and Danny Masterson connection is just crazy to me.